In the spring of 1945, the Pacific War had reached a point where the outcome was no longer in doubt, but the violence had not diminished. If anything, it had grown more desperate, more brutal, and more symbolic. American forces were advancing ever closer to the Japanese home islands, island by island, paying in blood for every mile gained. Iwo Jima had fallen after one of the fiercest battles in Marine Corps history, and now Okinawa loomed as the final stepping stone before an invasion of Japan itself. For the Imperial Japanese Navy, this moment represented not just a military crisis, but an existential one. The fleet that had once terrorized the Pacific, that had struck Pearl Harbor and swept through Southeast Asia, was now a shadow of itself. Fuel was scarce, trained pilots were nearly gone, and many of Japan's greatest warships already lay at the bottom of the ocean. By early 1945, the Japanese Navy knew it could no longer win conventional battles. The decisive fleet actions that Japanese planners had once dreamed of were no longer possible. Carrier aviation, once Japan's greatest strength, had been shattered at Midway, the Philippine Sea, and Leyte Gulf. The remaining carriers sat idle, either damaged or lacking aircraft and pilots. Battleships that had once symbolized imperial power were now largely irrelevant in a war dominated by aircraft. Yet one battleship remained, enormous and almost mythical in reputation: Yamato. She was the largest battleship ever built, armed with 18.1-inch guns capable of firing shells heavier than a small car, and protected by armor thicker than anything afloat. Yamato had been designed for a different war, one where battleships would decide the fate of empires in gun duels across open seas. Instead, she had spent much of the war confined to port, preserved as a symbol and a last resort. As American forces prepared to invade Okinawa in April 1945, Japanese leaders faced an agonizing dilemma. Okinawa was part of the Japanese home defense perimeter. Losing it would give the Americans airfields within range of Japan itself and a staging area for invasion. The Imperial Japanese Army planned to throw everything it had into the defense of the island, including massive kamikaze attacks intended to cripple the American fleet. The Imperial Japanese Navy, however, had little left to contribute. Its remaining ships were precious and irreplaceable, yet keeping them idle while Okinawa burned seemed dishonorable. Emperor Hirohito reportedly questioned what role the Navy intended to play in the defense. In a system where imperial expectation carried immense weight, this question was enough to push naval leaders toward a decision they knew was militarily futile but symbolically powerful. Thus was born Operation Tengo, a plan that was less a strategy than a gesture of defiance. The concept was simple and grim. Yamato would sail from Japan with a small escort of cruisers and destroyers, head south toward Okinawa, and fight its way through the American fleet. The ship carried only enough fuel for a one-way journey. There was no plan for retreat. If Yamato reached Okinawa, she would beach herself and continue fighting as a stationary gun platform until destroyed. The surviving crew would then join the ground defense of the island. It was, in essence, a naval kamikaze mission, sacrificing the largest battleship in history in the hope of inflicting damage, boosting morale, and preserving honor. Vice Admiral Seiichi Ito, commander of the Second Fleet, was tasked with leading the mission. Ito was a professional officer, not a fanatic, and he understood the reality of the situation. He knew that sending Yamato into waters dominated by American carrier aviation was almost certainly a death sentence. Unlike earlier battles, there would be no surprise, no cover of darkness sufficient to hide such a massive ship. American submarines and aircraft would find Yamato quickly, and waves of bombers would do what no surface fleet ever had. Ito reportedly objected to the plan, arguing that the ship and its crew would be better used in the defense of Japan itself. But the implication that the emperor expected action left little room for refusal. Once the decision was framed as a matter of imperial will, opposition became impossible. On April 6, 1945, Yamato prepared to sail. The ship's crew was briefed on the mission, and they understood that it was likely a one-way trip. Some of the youngest sailors and those considered unfit for combat were removed from the ship, a small mercy that acknowledged the near certainty of destruction. Those who remained drilled intensively in anti-aircraft defense and damage control. Yamato's decks bristled with anti-aircraft guns, far more than she had carried earlier in the war, reflecting hard lessons learned from the sinking of her sister ship Musashi. Even so, no amount of preparation could change the fundamental imbalance of power. That afternoon, Yamato left port accompanied by the light cruiser Yahagi and 8 destroyers. The formation was modest, reflecting Japan's dwindling naval strength. As the ships steamed south at high speed, they were already being watched. American submarines detected the force not long after it departed, shadowing it and reporting its position. Unlike earlier moments in the war, there would be no ambiguity, no uncertainty about where Yamato was heading. The American fleet knew exactly what was coming. For the men aboard Yamato, the hours after departure were heavy with unspoken tension. The sea was calm, the sky clear, but everyone understood that American aircraft would soon appear. The battleship's immense guns, designed to dominate enemy ships, were largely useless against the real threat. The war had changed, and Yamato was sailing into a battlefield where size and armor meant less than speed, coordination, and air superiority. Still, there was a sense of grim resolve. Yamato carried not just weapons, but symbolism. She represented the soul of the Japanese Navy, and perhaps of Japan itself. As night fell, the task force continued southward, hoping against reason that they might reach Okinawa before the Americans could respond in force. But the distance was too great, and the enemy too alert. By dawn on April 7th, American carrier aircraft were already being launched. Hundreds of planes lifted off from decks stretching across the horizon, forming one of the largest air strikes of the entire war. Yamato, the pride of the Imperial Navy, was about to face the full weight of modern naval warfare alone. And with that, Operation Tengo moved from desperate planning to irreversible reality. Destruction. At roughly the same time, hundreds of miles away, the American Fifth Fleet was already reacting. Admiral Raymond Spruance, overseeing operations around Okinawa, had no intention of allowing Yamato to reach the invasion beaches. The lessons of earlier battles were clear. Battleships, no matter how powerful, could be destroyed by carrier aircraft long before they ever fired a shot. Task Force 58, commanded by Vice Admiral Mark Mitcher, began launching wave after wave of planes as soon as Yamato's position was confirmed. Fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers streamed southward, forming massive aerial armadas that dwarfed anything Japan could muster. By mid-morning, Yamato's radar operators detected incoming aircraft. The warning was brief. Soon, black specks appeared on the horizon, growing rapidly larger. The American pilots had been briefed carefully. Yamato was the primary target. The destroyers and cruiser escorting her were secondary. The goal was simple: overwhelm the battleship's defenses with coordinated attacks from multiple directions, forcing her to maneuver and exposing her vulnerable underside to torpedoes. Aircraft positions, suppressing gunners and damaging fire control systems. Dive bombers followed, screaming down from high altitude, releasing bombs aimed at Yamato's deck armor, gun turrets, and superstructure. Almost simultaneously, torpedo bombers approached at low altitude, skimming the waves from both port and starboard sides. Yamato erupted in fire. Her anti-aircraft guns unleashed a furious barrage, filling the sky with black bursts and tracer fire. The volume of fire was staggering, but it was not enough. The battleship shuddered as the first torpedoes struck her port side. Damage control teams rushed to flooded compartments, sealing bulkheads and counter-flooding to correct the growing list. Yamato had been designed to absorb punishment, and at first, she seemed to confirm her reputation. Bomb hits scorched the deck and wrecked equipment, but her vital systems remained operational. For a moment, it appeared as if the ship might endure the assault. But the attacks did not stop. The first wave withdrew, and the second arrived almost immediately. This relentless tempo was something the Japanese had rarely faced earlier in the war. There was no pause to regroup, no respite to make repairs. American carriers could launch strike after strike, maintaining pressure until the target collapsed. Yamato's gunners fought with determination, shooting down several aircraft, but each loss was insignificant compared to the sheer number of planes attacking. Torpedoes continued to slam into the battleship's port side. American pilots deliberately concentrated their attacks there, knowing that repeated hits on one side would overwhelm Yamato's ability to compensate through counter-flooding. The ship began to list more severely. Inside the hull, water poured into compartments, electrical systems failed, and fires spread. Damage control crews worked desperately, often waist-deep in water or smoke, knowing that their efforts might only delay the inevitable. The escorting ships suffered as well. The light cruiser Yahagi was hit repeatedly, losing power and eventually sinking under sustained attack. Several destroyers were damaged or sunk as they attempted to shield Yamato, laying smoke screens and firing their own anti-aircraft guns until overwhelmed. These smaller ships stood little chance against the massed air assault, yet their crews fought with grim determination, fully aware of their fate. By early afternoon, Yamato's situation had become critical. Her speed dropped sharply as flooding worsened and engines were damaged. Steering became difficult, and the list increased to dangerous levels. Admiral Ito and his staff monitored the situation from the bridge, receiving reports that painted an increasingly dire picture. Communications with some compartments were lost entirely. Anti-aircraft fire slackened as guns were destroyed or ran out of ammunition. Another wave of American aircraft arrived, larger than the previous ones. Dive bombers struck near Yamato's forward magazines, while torpedoes hit almost simultaneously. One particularly devastating explosion ripped through the ship's interior, killing hundreds of sailors in an instant. Fires burned uncontrollably. The ship's proud silhouette, once the embodiment of Japanese naval power, was now scarred, smoking, and visibly dying. At approximately 2 p.m., Yamato's list exceeded 20 degrees. Movement on deck became nearly impossible. Sailors struggled to stand, clinging to railings or crawling across tilted surfaces. Inside, compartments that had once been above water were now flooding rapidly. Damage control efforts became futile. The ship was no longer fighting to survive, only to delay the end. Admiral Ito faced an agonizing decision. Continuing the mission was no longer possible. Yamato would never reach Okinawa. At around 2:02 p.m., he ordered the crew to abandon ship, though the command came too late for many. Thousands of sailors were still trapped inside, unable to escape as the angle increased and internal passages filled with water and smoke. Minutes later, Yamato capsized. As she rolled onto her side, the immense pressure on her internal structures became unbearable. At 2:23 p.m., a massive explosion erupted as her forward magazines detonated. The blast was so powerful it was seen from miles away, sending a towering mushroom cloud of smoke and debris into the sky. The shockwave shook nearby American aircraft. The largest battleship ever built vanished beneath the waves in a matter of moments. Of the more than 3,300 men aboard Yamato, fewer than 300 survived. The sea around the sinking site was littered with debris, oil, and struggling sailors. American aircraft circled briefly, confirming the kill, then departed to rejoin their carriers. The battle was over. Operation Tengo had ended in total annihilation. For the Japanese Navy, the loss of Yamato was not just a military defeat but a psychological one. The ship had represented ultimate strength, invincibility, and national pride. Her destruction demonstrated, beyond any remaining doubt, that battleships could not survive in a sky dominated by enemy aircraft. It also underscored the hopelessness of Japan's strategic situation. Even the greatest symbols of power could be erased in hours by a superior industrial and technological force. Yet within Japan, Yamato's final mission was quickly mythologized. The sacrifice was framed as noble, heroic, and necessary, a final stand against overwhelming odds. For many, it became a metaphor for the nation's struggle itself, magnificent, courageous, and doomed. But behind the symbolism lay a harsher truth. Operation Tengo had achieved nothing militarily. It had not delayed the invasion of Okinawa. It had not inflicted serious losses on the American fleet. It had consumed irreplaceable lives and resources for the sake of honor and expectation rather than strategic necessity. The sinking of Yamato marked the effective end of the Imperial Japanese Navy as a fighting force. From that day forward, Japan's remaining resistance would come primarily from the air and the ground, through kamikaze attacks and desperate island defenses. The era of great warships battling for control of the seas had ended, not with a climactic duel, but with a slaughter from the sky. And still, the war went on. In the aftermath of Yamato's destruction, the sea itself seemed to swallow the last illusions of Imperial Japanese naval power. Survivors clung to wreckage or floated amid oil-slicked water, watching the sky empty of American aircraft. For those men, Operation Tengo had not felt like a grand sacrifice or a symbolic gesture. It had been confusion, fire, screaming metal, and the sudden realization that the world's largest battleship could not protect them. Rescue came slowly. A handful of destroyers, themselves damaged and low on fuel, circled back under the risk of renewed air attack to pull survivors from the water. Most would never be found. Word of the sinking spread quickly through the Japanese chain of command. Naval headquarters received fragmented reports at first, then confirmation that Yamato, Yahagi, and several destroyers were gone. The reaction was muted, almost numb. By April 1945, catastrophe had become routine. The loss of the pride of the fleet was devastating, but it was also expected. Senior officers understood that sending Yamato south had been an act of desperation rather than a realistic military operation. There were no reinforcements to follow, no reserves to rebuild. Japan's navy had been spent. The American response was far different. For the crews of Task Force 58, the destruction of Yamato was another successful strike in an increasingly one-sided campaign. Pilots returned to their carriers to debrief, refuel, and prepare for the next mission. Many expressed astonishment at the size of the battleship and the intensity of the anti-aircraft fire, but few doubted the outcome. The engagement reinforced what had already been proven at Pearl Harbor, Midway, and the Philippine Sea. Air power ruled the seas. No surface ship, no matter how heavily armored, could survive sustained carrier-based attacks without air cover. Operation Tengo also had immediate implications for the Battle of Okinawa. American planners had feared that Yamato might attempt to bombard invasion beaches, disrupting supply lines and morale. Her destruction removed that threat entirely. The invasion continued, brutal and costly, but without interference from Japan's remaining capital ships. The Japanese Navy would never again attempt a large-scale surface operation. From that point forward, its role was largely confined to suicide missions, coastal defense, and symbolic resistance. Within Japan, news of Yamato's loss was initially withheld from the public. The government maintained strict control over information, presenting the war as ongoing and resolvable despite mounting evidence to the contrary. When details eventually emerged, they were framed carefully. Yamato's crew had fought bravely. The ship had died gloriously. The emphasis was placed on honor, sacrifice, and loyalty to the emperor. The strategic failure of the mission was ignored. The fact that Yamato never fired her main guns in anger was left unspoken. This disconnect between reality and narrative reflected a deeper problem within Japan's wartime leadership. Operation Tengo was conceived not because it made strategic sense, but because doing nothing was seen as unacceptable. Yamato existed to fight, and if she could not change the outcome of the war, she could at least die in accordance with the warrior ideal that dominated Japanese military thinking. The logic was emotional, cultural, and ideological rather than practical. It prioritized symbolism over survival. For historians, Tengo stands as a stark example of how industrial imbalance shapes modern warfare. Yamato represented the pinnacle of battleship design, the result of years of planning, secrecy, and immense resources. Yet she faced an enemy capable of producing hundreds of aircraft, training thousands of pilots, and replacing losses faster than Japan could respond. The United States did not need a single decisive blow. It could apply continuous pressure, grinding down even the most formidable opponents through attrition and overwhelming force. The battle also underscored the failure of Japan's naval doctrine. For decades, Japanese planners had envisioned a decisive surface engagement in which battleships would annihilate the U.S. fleet in a climactic showdown. That moment never came. Instead, the decisive battles were fought by aircraft at ranges that rendered battleship guns largely irrelevant. Yamato's massive 18.1-inch guns, the largest ever mounted on a warship, were useless against enemies she could neither see nor reach. Survivor accounts from Yamato paint a haunting picture of the ship's final hours. Sailors described intense heat, suffocating smoke, and corridors flooded faster than men could escape. Some continued to man their guns even as the ship listed dangerously, firing at aircraft they could barely track. Others prayed, wrote final notes, or simply waited as the angle increased and gravity did the rest. The explosion that destroyed Yamato killed thousands instantly, sparing them the slow drowning that claimed so many others. In the years after the war, Yamato's wreck became a symbol both within Japan and abroad. Resting more than 1,000 feet below the surface, her remains were eventually discovered by deep-sea expeditions. Images of the shattered hull, massive guns still attached, and the sheer scale of the wreck reignited fascination with the ship and her fate. For some, Yamato represented courage and sacrifice. For others, she was a monument to strategic folly. Operation Tengo also forced naval thinkers worldwide to confront uncomfortable truths. The age of the battleship had ended not with a duel of giants, but with an execution by aircraft. Navies around the world adjusted accordingly. Aircraft carriers became the centerpiece of naval power. Battleships, once the ultimate measure of a nation's strength, were relegated to secondary roles or scrapped entirely. Yamato's destruction was not just Japan's loss. It was the final verdict on an entire era of warfare. Despite this, Yamato's legend grew. Books, films, and memorials portrayed her final mission as tragic and heroic. The phrase, "The bigger they come, the harder they fall," seemed almost tailor-made for her story. She was the biggest, the most heavily armed, the most protected, and yet she fell faster than many smaller ships had earlier in the war. Her size, once her greatest strength, made her an irresistible target. Operation Tengo did not change the outcome of the war, but it clarified it. Japan no longer possessed the means to contest American control of the sea. The industrial and technological gap was too wide. Okinawa would fall. The bombing of the Japanese home islands would intensify. The final acts of the war were already taking shape. For the men who survived Yamato, the weight of that realization lingered long after the fighting ended. They had sailed aboard the greatest warship ever built, only to watch it vanish beneath the waves in a matter of hours. Their survival felt accidental, even undeserved. Many carried that burden for the rest of their lives, living reminders of a mission that was never meant to succeed. And still, in April 1945, the war demanded more. In the days that followed Operation Tengo, the Japanese High Command struggled to reconcile what had happened with what they had hoped might happen. Yamato had been sent south as the embodiment of national resolve, yet her destruction exposed how hollow that resolve had become when stripped of material support. The Imperial Navy had gambled its last great symbol and lost it in a single afternoon. What remained was not a fleet, but fragments, isolated destroyers, dwindling fuel reserves, and air units increasingly dominated by suicide tactics. Among naval officers, the sinking of Yamato quietly confirmed what many had already suspected. The decisive battle doctrine that had guided Japanese naval strategy since before the war had failed completely. The long-anticipated surface engagement between battleships never occurred. Instead, the decisive blows were delivered by aircraft launched from carriers far beyond the reach of heavy guns. Yamato had not fallen because she was poorly designed or incompetently crewed. She fell because the nature of war had changed, and Japan had been unable or unwilling to change with it. American analysts studied the battle closely. Reports emphasized the effectiveness of concentrated air attacks, the importance of coordination between fighter suppression and torpedo strikes, and the vulnerability of even the most heavily armored ships to repeated underwater hits. Yamato's fate reinforced tactical doctrines already in use, validating the belief that air power, not armor thickness, determined naval survival. The United States Navy did not merely destroy Yamato, it learned from her death. Back in Japan, the loss of Yamato was gradually woven into a narrative of heroic sacrifice. Newspapers and official statements spoke of valor and duty, avoiding mention of the mission's futility. The idea that Yamato had been sent to die was not openly acknowledged, but it was understood. Her final voyage was portrayed as an offering, a demonstration of loyalty to the emperor and the nation. This framing resonated with a population already conditioned to accept suffering as a moral necessity. Yet beneath the rhetoric, cracks were forming. Civilians were increasingly aware that the war was being lost. American bombers roamed the skies over Japanese cities with growing impunity. Food shortages worsened. The myth of invincibility, already damaged by defeats at Midway and Leyte Gulf, could not withstand the loss of Yamato. If the greatest battleship ever built could be annihilated so easily, what hope remained? Operation Tengo also had a profound psychological impact on American forces. The sinking of Yamato was widely celebrated, not just as a military victory, but as symbolic proof that Japan's last defenses were collapsing. Pilots who participated in the attack later recalled the sense of finality that accompanied the mission. Yamato was not just another target. She was the embodiment of Japan's naval ambition. Destroying her felt like closing a chapter of the war. For the men fighting on Okinawa, the destruction of Yamato meant one less threat, but it did not make the battle easier. The fighting on land remained savage, with Japanese defenders employing entrenched positions, artillery, and kamikaze attacks against American ships offshore. Yamato's absence did not shorten the battle, but it ensured that no large-scale naval counterattack would disrupt the invasion. The sea around Okinawa belonged entirely to the United States. The wreck of Yamato settled into silence beneath the waves, but her story continued to grow. Survivors gave interviews years later, offering glimpses into life aboard the ship and the chaos of her final hours. Their accounts varied in detail but shared common themes: disbelief at the scale of the attack, pride in the ship, and sorrow for lost comrades. Many spoke of the moment they realized Yamato would not survive, describing it as both terrifying and strangely calm. Historians debated whether Operation Tengo was inevitable or avoidable. Some argued that Yamato should have been preserved as a defensive asset or never built at all, given the rise of air power. Others contended that by 1945, Japan had no good options left. Yamato's final mission, while militarily pointless, reflected the strategic dead end Japan had reached. It was not the cause of defeat, but a symptom of it. The phrase, "The bigger they come, the harder they fall," captured the essence of Yamato's fate with brutal simplicity. Her immense size and power made her a prime target, and once located, she could not hide, maneuver effectively, or escape sustained attack. Her destruction illustrated how technological superiority is meaningless without adaptability. Strength without flexibility becomes a liability. Outdated thinking and misplaced priorities. Both interpretations held elements of truth. Yamato was magnificent, and she was doomed. Operation Tengo marked the final time Japan attempted to use its surface fleet in a conventional offensive role. From that point forward, resistance would come through desperate measures, kamikaze attacks, suicide boats, and last-ditch defenses on islands and beaches. The war's final months would be defined not by grand maneuvers, but by grinding attrition and devastating firepower. For the United States, Yamato's sinking reinforced confidence in the strategy that would carry the war to its conclusion. Carrier task forces, protected by layered defenses and supported by overwhelming industrial output, could strike anywhere, anytime. No enemy ship, no matter how powerful, could challenge that dominance. As the war moved inexorably toward its final act, the image of Yamato burning and capsizing remained etched in the memories of those who witnessed it. It was the death of a ship, but also the death of an idea, the belief that size, armor, and tradition alone could secure victory. The Pacific War still had months to run, and its ending would bring destruction on a scale even greater than Yamato's loss. But in April 1945, beneath the open sky and rolling seas south of Kyushu, the fate of Imperial Japan's navy had already been sealed. In the weeks after Operation Tengo, the war moved relentlessly toward its end, but Yamato's destruction lingered as a quiet turning point. It was not a battle that changed maps or shifted front lines, yet it marked the final confirmation that Imperial Japan could no longer contest control of the sea in any meaningful way. What had once been the centerpiece of Japanese naval ambition now rested on the ocean floor, shattered and silent, while American carrier groups continued to operate with near-total freedom. Within Japan, Yamato's loss became part of a broader psychological reckoning. The government continued to speak of honor and sacrifice, but ordinary citizens could see the evidence of defeat all around them. Cities burned under incendiary raids. Transportation networks collapsed. Food shortages worsened. The idea that Japan could still win the war through sheer willpower grew increasingly difficult to sustain. Yamato had been a symbol of strength meant to inspire confidence. Her annihilation achieved the opposite. For many naval officers who survived the war, Operation Tengo was remembered with bitterness rather than pride. Some privately admitted that the mission should never have been ordered. Fuel was desperately needed elsewhere. Trained sailors were irreplaceable. Yamato's final sortie consumed both for no tangible gain. Yet few dared to voice such criticism during the war itself. By April 1945, questioning orders was seen as disloyal, even dangerous. The momentum of sacrifice had become unstoppable. American naval leadership, by contrast, viewed Tengo as a final validation of carrier warfare. The battle required no extraordinary risks, no heroic improvisation. It was methodical, calculated, and devastatingly efficient. Aircraft were launched, targets identified, attack patterns coordinated, and the enemy destroyed. Losses were minimal. From a strategic standpoint, it was the logical endpoint of lessons learned since Pearl Harbor. The sinking of Yamato also influenced how the war would be remembered. In post-war narratives, she often stood as a tragic giant, doomed by forces beyond her control. This framing softened the reality that her destruction was not a noble duel, but a one-sided execution carried out by aircraft that never came within range of her guns. Romance replaced analysis. Myth replaced doctrine. When divers and researchers later explored Yamato's wreck, they found her broken apart, her massive turrets torn from their mounts by the internal explosion. The wreck told a story that words could not fully capture. This was not the graceful sinking of a proud ship slipping beneath the waves. It was violent, sudden, and catastrophic. The sea floor became her grave, and with it, the grave of an era. Operation Tengo remains one of history's clearest demonstrations of how technological and industrial realities shape warfare. Yamato represented extraordinary engineering skill, but engineering alone could not overcome strategic imbalance. Japan lacked the fuel, aircraft, pilots, and industrial capacity to protect or replace such a vessel. The United States, by contrast, could afford to lose dozens of aircraft and replace them within weeks. Victory followed production lines as much as courage. The phrase, "The bigger they come, the harder they fall," resonates because Yamato's fall was absolute. There was no prolonged campaign, no drawn-out resistance. Once found, she was doomed. Her size made her impossible to conceal, her mission made retreat impossible, and her lack of air cover made survival impossible. Every factor aligned toward destruction. For the men who flew against her, Yamato was an unforgettable sight. Pilots described her as enormous, unmistakable, surrounded by white wakes from escorting ships and black bursts from anti-aircraft fire. Some felt awe. Others felt grim satisfaction. Few felt pity in the moment. The war had stripped sentiment away. Yamato was a target, and targets were meant to be destroyed. As the war neared its conclusion, attention shifted toward the Japanese home islands and the escalating bombing campaign. The invasion of Okinawa continued to consume lives on both sides. Kamikaze attacks inflicted damage and terror, but they could not reverse the strategic balance. Japan's defeat was no longer a question of if, but when and how. In August 1945, the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki brought the war to an abrupt end. In hindsight, Yamato's final mission appears as a prelude to that ending, a last, futile attempt to resist a force that had already surpassed traditional measures of power. The battleship, once the ultimate weapon of sea control, had been rendered obsolete even before the war concluded. Today, Operation Tengo is studied not because it was brilliant, but because it was tragic. It demonstrates what happens when pride, tradition, and symbolism override realism. Yamato's crew fought bravely. Their courage is not in question, but courage alone cannot compensate for strategic failure. The lesson is uncomfortable yet essential. Yamato's story endures because it speaks to a universal truth about power. Size and strength inspire fear, but adaptability decides outcomes. The battleship was built for a world that no longer existed by the time she sailed on her final mission. She was magnificent, and she was doomed. Operation Tengo did not delay defeat. It did not change the course of the war, but it did leave behind a stark image. The greatest warship ever built, destroyed in hours by forces she could not fight. In that image lies the true meaning of the phrase that defines her fate. The bigger they come, the harder they fall.